I'm going to show you the top 5 communication skills that you should prioritize for professional settings. These will not just help you be effective, but if you do them well, these are the skills that'll make you come across like a leader. Take a look at my website if you'd like. We have a bunch of free resources there about these very skills. I'll put a link to the free page in the expandable description below this video. Far and away, the number 1 communication skill you should invest your time in is public speaking. Competent presenters get noticed very quickly in professional settings. I've said this before, but if you're up in front of people and you do a good job presenting, listeners will think to themselves when they see you, that's a leader. Public speaking is like an escalator for your career when everybody else has taken the stairs. Many communication skills are considered soft skills, but public speaking is a hard skill like writing, math, or even design. And it's one that drastically lacks among many professionals. So if you're good at it, people notice very quickly. There are 3 types of public speaking that you should work on. The first is regular old informative speaking skills. You can do informative speaking anytime you're standing up and training people, running an in-house workshop or orientation, giving quarterly reports, anytime the purpose is to share information with a large group. Informative speaking is the most common type of public speaking you'll do professionally. The goal of informing your listeners is usually to equip them to do their jobs better or simply to teach them something valuable. The next type of public speaking in professional settings is persuasive speaking. This is where you want to convince listeners to change their minds or their behaviors by the end of your speech. You'll often see this type of presentation done when you're talking to clients who you want to do business with. Internally, anytime you're asking the people above you for approval, funding, some type of support, you'll often be speaking to them in a persuasive way. You're trying to earn a yes, in other words, when you do persuasive speaking. The third most common type for professional settings is what we call impromptu speaking. This happens when you're asked to speak in the spur of the moment with little or no time for preparation. Maybe you have a couple of minutes to sketch out some bullet points on a notepad, but there's really no time for anything else. So let's say you show up in a meeting and the big boss is going to run the meeting that day. And he says, I'd like to hear an update on how everybody's departments are doing. Now, you didn't know the boss was going to ask you for this in advance, but by the time it's your turn to speak, you better come up with something that has some clear talking points. Now, you'll notice that I'm not talking here about big inspirational speeches or keynote presentations that you'll see full-time speakers do. 99% of public speaking in professional settings are just regular old, informative, persuasive, or impromptu messages. The second most important communication skill is what we call verbal communication. You'll show your verbal skills anytime you're making a regular task-related contribution to group meetings or discussions, and when you're meeting in one-on-one working sessions with subordinates, peers, or supervisors. When people say good verbal communication, they're usually referring to a few related skills. Number 1, they want you to speak in concise sentences and deliver a concise overall message. In contrast, if you're long-winded, you ramble on and on, nobody's going to give you credit for having good verbal communication skills. You also want to speak in clear main points. You will frequently hear people at group meetings when they're giving status updates, for example, they'll use signposts to signal that they have a certain number of main points. They might say first, second, and third when they're talking about their 3 points. That's called signposting because you're signaling your points and you're reminding your listeners about what point you're talking about in the moment. This adds clarity to your message and it shows that you are prepared. A third quality of good verbal communication is speaking in plain, understandable language. I posted an entire video about this a while back that shows you should avoid abbreviations, acronyms, industry jargon, fancy vocabulary words. All of those will confuse your listeners and create a gap in understanding. Instead, you want to use the plain English version of words as often as possible. Speak in everyday language. I'll put a link to that video in the description below this one because I get a lot of pushback from viewers about this tip. But there's research and plenty of practical experience supporting this. Fancy vocabulary words, abbreviations, and the other things I've mentioned cause misunderstandings and hurt your credibility. Number 3 is interpersonal communication skills. We use this term as a catch-all bucket for how you talk to people one-on-one in the hallway and in small group meetings. People with good interpersonal skills are able to build relationships and form connections with other people. They are able to empathize and understand where other people are coming from, and then adapt their communication accordingly. If things get a little tense, people with good interpersonal skills effectively manage those disagreements and potential conflicts. You may notice we're talking about the relationship side of conversations here. This is an oversimplification, but researchers often break communication down into two halves. On one side, there's the task-related conversations and communication. We talked about that a moment ago when we were referring to verbal communication skills. And then there's the relationship side of communication. We generally refer to those as interpersonal communication skills. Good, well-rounded communicators can handle both sides of this world really well. The fourth skill is working well in groups and teams, and that includes general discussions, problem-solving sessions, and collaboration. If you think about it, communication is the central activity when you're working in groups and teams. If everybody stopped talking, the meeting would be over. The work stops when communication stops, in other words. And that means when you show up in groups, you want your communication to be at its best. For example, demonstrating a collaborative spirit is an important aspect of team communication. A lot of times, in contrast, people sometimes use groups and that public setting as a way to compete with other people in the room and climb some hierarchy. But the most effective teams and team members are filled with professionals who instead see everybody in the room as equal collaborators. One of the easiest ways to stand out as a good communicator in groups is to understand the problem-solving process. Many people over the years I've worked with are very good at pointing out all the problems, shortcomings, and even tear down other people's ideas as quickly as they bring them up. But a smaller percentage of people understand that the real trick is to be good at offering potential solutions. So when you're in a group situation, it's fine to identify problems some of the time, but be sure to turn the corner in the conversation and transition toward talking about solutions. Even if the group doesn't end up going with your solution, the one you recommended, you'll still play an instrumental role in turning the conversation in a productive direction that doesn't spiral into some complaint session, which happens a lot in meetings. And number 5, no conversation about this would be complete unless we talked about listening. So far, everything we said is really about talking on this list. But the truth is you'll spend most of your time listening. In my recent co-authored book with Julian Mirvell, Positive Communication for Leaders, we cite a statistic that shows that leaders listen twice as much as the average employee. There's an old expression, leaders are listeners. Listening skills always sound fairly basic when you explain them, so the trick here is not to think of this as information only. The question is, are you listening this way? Knowing what to do doesn't cut it. You have to actually do it. So instead of calling these tips, I'll call them reminders. Good listeners make eye contact, they lean in, and they remove all distractions so they can 100% focus on the other person. To make sure they're comprehending the other speaker, they sometimes take notes, they may ask clarifying questions, and they communicate with back-channel cues to show they're listening by saying, yeah. Even though these behaviors may sound basic, if you put these listening reminders into practice, you would almost automatically be in the top 10% of listeners that I've met. Here again are the top 5 communication skills professionals should prioritize. Which of these skills do you personally need the most work on? Tell me about that in the comments section. I also have an entire page on my website that's packed with free resources that get into these very skills and many others. I'll put a link to that in the description below the video. Till next time, thanks, God bless, and I will see you soon.